When was let me put it this way. When was the first time that we were commanded not to eat something? The Garden of Eden. So fasting was instituted at the Garden of Eden when God said, do not eat of that tree, where there's the command not to eat something. Likewise, our fasting in this day and age has become more detailed and regimented through the fasting periods of the church. But the first call and the first command of fasting should not be something that is strange to us, and that we as Orthodox Christians should look at fasting and say, well, that's a man-made rule. These are things that the church came up with. These aren't what God wanted, and all those types of distortions that we may make in order to justify our desire not to fast. Now, those who said that Moses, we had fasting there, we had fasting with Christ specifically where he fasted for the 40 days. But if you think back to the Garden of Eden, God said, do not eat of that tree, for that tree will bring you nothing good but death. That's what you have to stay away from. And yet, with all the wonderful fruits that were in the Garden of Eden, and if we look at all the wonderful foods that were available for Adam and Eve, that they chose to eat from that tree, not because of the food, but because of the disobedience. So as we fast in this coming Lenten period, we have to remember it's not about the food specifically, it's about the obedience. The obedience to follow the regiment of the fasting of the church. If you think about it too, there's a, let me rewind here. There's a story, being involved with law enforcement, that they did a survey of a bunch of young children. And they took them in a room full of all brand new toys, every possible toy that was available. And they put it in the room, and then they took an unloaded revolver, a real handgun, put it in the corner, and told the kids, do not go near the handgun. You can play with all the toys. It's very reminiscent of the Garden of Eden, right? You play with all the toys, but don't touch that handgun over there because it's dangerous. And do you know what happened? They played for the toys for about 5-10 minutes, and then they all went over to the handgun. And then it was just a matter of time before they were touching it, and one kid would touch it to see what had happened. Am I going to explode? Am I going to blow up? And then by the end, the kids were actually picking it up and moving it. And it's little children. And you think about adults that should know better, and we think too that our fasting has to be one where we understand that it's about obedience to God. The obedience and the discipline to refrain from the things that God is calling us to refrain from. But if you look at what this period of Lent means to us, it's about fasting from several things, not just food, the discipline of food, but also licentiousness, debauchery, the things that, and those are fancy words for lustful pleasures, for unbridled materialism, for the curbing of our tongue, for speaking kindness to one another, that we embrace that instead of the judgment and the responses of criticism towards one another. Those are the things in the fasting period that we have to embrace in addition to the discipline of food. It was very interesting. I had spoken with Bishop Demetrius last week, and we were talking about fasting. And one of the things he said, he went to a particular parish and he saw everyone come up for communion. And afterwards he said, there's no way that everybody fasted Wednesday and Friday to come up and receive communion. There's no way. And he said, before you come up for communion again, make sure that you're fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, because there's no way, unless the entire parish is really on track, that everyone in the entire parish could have come up to receive Holy Communion. Now, that's a question you have to answer. Are you prepared to receive Holy Communion? Are you fasting? Are you praying? Are you doing those things to embrace the discipline, the obedience to God, so that when he says, with faith and with love draw forward, we come as obedient servants, but we also come with the discipline and the obedience of listening to God's commands, from fasting and from praying, that we are in a new state of embracing God. So St. Paul today mentions in his epistle about food, and he says, that the weak man eats vegetables and the strong man eats everything. But in the Orthodox Church, it's the saints of the church have shown that the strong man eats very little and the weak man eats very much. Now, think about that. In our lives, I saw a program the other day, and it was talking about exercise, and they had the person who was a heavyweight boxer on there, and he said, well, the nice thing about being a heavyweight boxer is you can eat as much as you want, but you just have to turn it into muscle. So there's no discipline of how much that person can eat. They can go above the weight, as much as weight as they need and feel possible they can put on. And that's supposed to make them stronger. In fact, in every particular scenario in the battles, we look at David and Goliath, we see that David was small of stature and Goliath was huge. He was one of the undefeated warriors, and he was considered a monster, a giant. And he was taken down by this small David, who became great in the eyes of the church, but very small of physical stature. So when we think about what the world tells us about being strong and about being weak, we really have to flip it around, because some of the greatest saints were those who ate very little and were very disciplined and fasted their entire life so that they could embrace God and become strong in the faith. In fact, Elder Paisio says he was talking to someone who was talking about space, and he said, he goes, the person was saying, we spent billions of dollars going to the moon, and we have this space program, we have NASA and all these things, and he's like, oh, okay. How much did you spend to go there? And they said, well, it was billions and billions of dollars to build a spaceship and to go there. And he said to the man, he said, did you find God when you went to the moon? And the man said, no. And he says, you could take a piece of dry bread and you can find God. In other words, fast and pray and you'll be able to find God. Don't worry about the extraordinary measures that we sometimes seek in order to find God, whether that's reading into our astrology or all these fortune-telling things that the world tells us. If you look into these things, you'll find God. Well, you won't find God. You'll find the devil, and you'll be distorted and taken away. But the church tells us that it's about the obedience, the discipline of fasting, so that we can come into the embrace of God. If fasting wasn't important, it wouldn't have been mentioned in the book of Genesis. It wouldn't have been practiced by Christ himself, and it wouldn't have been practiced even by the apostles after the time of Christ when they fasted as well. And we know that their fasting of the pagans was on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the early writing of the apostles, which was called the Didache in Latin, which means the teaching, specifically written by them, says that in order to distinguish yourself as Christians, we continue the fast of Christ, and we will fast on Wednesdays and Fridays, remembering the betrayal of Christ and the crucifixion of Christ. And this time of year, when we come to the fasting period of the 40 days before Easter, before Pascha, we look at that discipline of Christ himself. That before, if we think about why do we do it now? Why do we fast before Easter? Well, Christ himself fasted right after he was baptized. He was baptized, he went into the desert, fasted, he came out of the desert, began his ministry, and then that was the beginning of the end, the beginning of the suffering, the beginning of the end of his worldly ministry in the sense that he fasts, he goes out, does his ministry, and he knows that each day he's doing his ministry is coming one day closer to his suffering and his passion. So likewise, we fast during this time to prepare ourselves for the suffering and the passion of Christ, but also the suffering and the passion of our own lives, to look at what's happening around us and to discipline ourselves so that we can enter into spiritual warfare. The unseen warfare, as St. Nicodemus speaks about, the warfare that's going on behind what we can't see. And sometimes people think, well, Father, I don't see it, so it doesn't exist. And like I tell people, if you breathe every day, you don't see the air that you breathe, but you know it's there. And it was very interesting yesterday, for some reason, as I was driving, I happened to be behind two pickup trucks that were diesel. And as I had the air blowing in to control the temperature in my car. And as the truck went in front of me, of course it was on the Farnsworth 500, so that he hits the gas at the stoplight, and it puts off a puff of smoke, and it comes right in my vent because I'm right behind him. And I'm sitting there gagging on these fumes, and then it made me think too that all the fumes and the different things that we breathe from all the other vehicles that we can't smell. But when it becomes noxious, when it becomes visible, and it becomes so foul to the odor that we breathe it in and we say, oh, that is just absolutely terrible, and it's too much. Likewise, it can rain outside, your car can be washed clean, and sometimes you go through a car wash and it feels like you just drove through a perfume bottle with all the fragrances that are in the water to make it smell not moldy because it's recycled water. And we think about that, and what is going on that we can't see? Not the cloud of darkness that we see from maybe a truck, but also the cloud of darkness of evil that is there, that is we can't perceive. Does it mean it's not there because we can't see it? Well, we all know from carbon monoxide poisoning that you can't see it and it poisons you. So what is going on around us that is poisoning our lives that we can't see? Well, the only way that we can see those things and know those things and acknowledge those things is by the disciplines of the church, by fasting, by praying, by contemplation, by looking at your lives and seeing what you do and what needs to be changed. It's very interesting. Sometimes I hear people and I say they'll be in the hospital, or especially the elderly, not to pick on the elderly, although sometimes I feel like I'm right there beside you. Sometimes I'll go to a hospital and someone's on their deathbed, or they're just not doing well. And I say to them, do you want to receive confession now? Are you prepared to receive confession? And they say, Father, I haven't done anything wrong. And you know what my response is? You haven't done any thinking if you think you haven't done anything wrong. You haven't done any contemplation if you haven't done anything wrong. Because when God looks at you and he says, what did you do? And you say, I didn't do anything wrong. God's going to go like this. You see this giant big screen here? Click, explain this, explain that, explain that. And those things might be things that we in hindsight might say, oh, well, I didn't, the defense, the feeble defense. And as the prayers during the Lenten period say, that every defense before God is but a quote-unquote squalid remnant, which means it's a rotten piece of garbage that we could present to God as our defense. So as you go into, today is Forgiveness Sunday, every Sunday, really, the priest asks for forgiveness as he comes to receive confession. He turns towards the crowd and the congregation and says, my brothers and sisters, forgive me the sinner, which I ask of you on this day as well. But also, as you come to receive confession, communion, that you also confess to God for forgiveness as you come forward, and you should be prepared. You should have fasted, you should have prayed, you should be ready to receive the King of all. Because if we don't do those things, and if we don't contemplate what we're doing, and we say that, I haven't done anything wrong, then God will surely shock us back into reality. And the reality is that we are all sinful, and we all have something. Whether or not we see it, or whether or not we don't see it, it's there. And sometimes the most poisonous things in our lives are the things that are invisible. And the things that are visible, we can go around, right? We can step around it. We can slow down to get out of the fumes of the diesel truck, or we can stay away from the cloud of burning leaves and hold our breath as we go through the dead skunk on the street. We know those things. But the things that we can't see, we have to pray, we have to fast, that we can see them, that we can understand where they're coming from, we can understand who we are in the process, and that we can become closer to Christ in each and every day. Amen.